Hi, this is Catherine Hillis. I want to thank the folks with Watercolor Live for inviting me to share my skills with you. And today I'm going to show you some of my watercolor painting supplies and teach you the basic skills of watercolor painting. And then we're going to move on to some of the other techniques. I like to call them the sexy techniques or special effects of watercolor painting. Let's go. So let's talk about the supplies you're going to use. First of all, it's important to use professional grade paper. Good quality paper and good quality paint will equal the best result. There are many wonderful professional brands available, and it's important to find a paper that works for you. I like to buy full sheets so that I can paint any size I wish, but blocks are wonderful too. And I normally tape or clip my paper to my board. For a board, you can use any kind of lightweight board as long as it's water repellent. I love using a large palette, either square or round, with a lid on it that allows me to arrange the paint in the order of the color wheel. I spray my palette every night with water and then I put the lid on it. Now, any palette that you enjoy using is just fine. You can even use a white plate, but be sure to squeeze plenty of good quality professional grade paint into your palette before you work each day. Now, for this exercise that we're going to do, you may want to squeeze out just the colors that you're going to be using today. Brushes can be personal. A brush should feel like a good weight and feel comfortable in your hand. Some painters like to use natural hair brushes while others prefer synthetic. Still others might choose a blend. But it's important to own a good medium-sized round, which will probably be your good hard worker, a 1 or 1.5 or 2-inch wide flat, and any other flat brushes you like. Each brush has its own special job, such as a rigger for grasses and branches. My round brush does a lot of work. My flat brush is often used for more angular shapes. So I have my palette, water containers, paper towels, brushes, and pencils on my right because I am right-handed. And you should make everything comfortable for you and arrange things in the way that you like them and that will prevent problems. You know, sometimes students will put the water on one side and the palette and paint on the other, and you can imagine the problems that this can create. So I suggest that you arrange things that will prevent drips and problems and tilt your paper at a slight angle. A partially used paper towel roll works really well for this. So we're now ready to begin the 5 basic skills of watercolor painting. You may have already seen these skills described in a beginning watercolor book, but these are the essentials that you need to know. First, there's wet on wet and wet on dry. I have my paper taped down, and let's paint wet on wet. That means we're going to use wet diluted paint on wet paper. I'm going to dilute my paint first, and I have already done that here. I've diluted ultramarine blue and quinacridone rose to the consistency of milk. Then I have to wet the paper, and that initial wetting of the paper is pretty important. You can get the paper too wet, like a swimming pool, or you can leave it uneven, and that will leave areas that won't receive the paint. Or you can use too little water, and then the paint won't flow. So we're going to wet. You can see I have a fully loaded brush loaded with water. I'm going to overlap. Then I'm going to dip the brush in, tip it against the lip of the bowl, overlap, more water, tip, overlap, 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 overlap. Now my edges, I can see, are not wet, so I'm going to go back over the edges. I see a spot here. Sometimes you need to tip the paper in order to see whether it's evenly wet. Sometimes the tooth of the paper will repel the paint. So it's evenly wet now. I'm going to tip it just a little bit to check it. And sometimes you can leave it for just a minute and you know, the paper becomes just perfect. It's glistening evenly, so I'm going to dip my brush in the water, tip the excess water off, load with ultramarine blue all the way up to the ferrule, and I'm going to take that brush down. I'm going to load again and overlap, overlap, overlap. Need a little bit more blue, a little thicker. So I'm going to go over this again and just, you know, the paint is going to flow wherever there's water. So now I'm cleaning my brush, taking it to a paper towel. I'm going to dip it in the water again, tip it against the lip of the bowl, load with quinacridone rose, come over this area of ultramarine blue, overlapping and overlapping, overlapping. And I have a little bit too much water, so I can just take my paper towel and I'm going to make a nice neat fold here. I don't want to dab on the paper, that's a no-no, and I want to just tip the paper up here so that the paper towel just does absorb that excess moisture. And right there as well. Now I can tip this back and forth and let the paint move a little bit. And it's really quite a beautiful thing. Now, when would we use wet on wet? You would probably use it for skies, initial washes, toning the paper, or anytime you want a soft look without the hard edges. And just remember that wherever there is water, the paint is going to flow. So I have just a little bit more moisture and I want to push it down here. I can also pick that up with a thirsty brush, but in this case I'm just going to use the edge of the towel to grab that little tiny bit of moisture there. All right, now we're going to paint wet on dry. That just means dry paper, wet paint. So I'm going to take my brush again. My paint is diluted. I'm going to put a little more ultramarine blue here. We're going to dilute it to a milky consistency. This wet paint will go on dry paper this time. And I'm going to just take my brush, overlap. I didn't quite get to the edge there. I want to get to the edge and I want to overlap, overlap, overlap. This is going to leave a much harder edge where the two colors come together. We're going to load with this quinacridone rose now. And watch what happens here. I get a much sharper edge. It's not going to flow as much. So I'm overlapping my brush. And there's really no need to be going back and forth over any of these areas. That kind of kills the beauty of the watercolor paint. So you want to get the paint on with an economy of brush strokes, meaning as few brush strokes as possible. And let the watercolor paint do its work. Now, I might use this technique, wet on dry, for buildings, fields, figures, trees, just whenever I want to have a little bit more control. So there's the difference now between wet on wet, soft edged, and wet on dry, a little more control and a little harder edge. The third basic skill is called the glaze. Now this skill is wet on wet. You have to pre-wet the paper of the object you want to paint. Now in this case, I painted an apple, and here I have created 1, 2, 3, 4 glazes. The more I glaze this fruit, the more realistic it will become, to where it almost looks like I can pick that apple up and eat it. So if you want to get a lot of rich color, maybe develop form, contour, shape, then the glaze is the way to go. Now what I did was I had to carefully dry each shape after it was painted, and I did use a hairdryer for this. I have a hairdryer sitting right on my table here. And once the apple shape is completely dry, I know I'm not going to make mud. And that's a really important thing to remember, that your paper might look dry, but it really has to be dry. So on the second glaze, I re-wet the entire apple shape, and I put in only the colors I thought I needed. I thought I needed a little more yellow, a little more red. I even got a bloom over here, which sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not okay. I actually just left it. Then I dried it really carefully. The third glaze, the same process. Re-wet the entire shape after I was sure it was dry. And this time put in some more reds, some more shadow colors, some more yellows, a little bit of green. And always being sure that I've done that secret ingredient, which is drying my paper. And this is a great way to build richness. So let me show you how to paint a glaze. You can see that I have an apple shape painted here. I painted it more than 24 hours ago, so I know it's dry. I have my paint already diluted to the consistency of milk, an ultramarine blue, a quin rose, a lemon yellow, and a spring green. Because I do think I'm going to need those colors. And we can add a little bit of red as we go also. So what I want to do, oh, and of course the star of the show, my apple. I am painting on 140-pound rough paper today. I have been painting on cold press before, but we're changing to rough today just to kind of switch it up and for dry brush. So let's wet this shape. Again, we want to overlap as much as we can and try to make as few strokes as possible. We always want to pay attention to utilizing an economy of brush strokes. Too many brush strokes are not good for the paint. We're going to load up with the yellow. There's a lot more yellow back here and here in the throat of the apple. This is, of course, going to be my second glaze. And as I showed you a little while ago, you can paint as many glazes as you want. Now notice I've only put the yellow in a couple of places. And now I'm going to use a little rose in just a few places, not everywhere. And because this entire shape is wet, the paint will flow in a beautiful way. And I am now taking the brush in the shape of the apple to begin building up form. I don't want to worry about stripes. I know a lot of times this is what beginners like to focus on, but what I really want to get is contour and depth if I can. And not so much the texture right now. That's for another day. I'm going to move to a smaller brush. I'm going to wet it. You notice I'm going to load it with this beautiful spring green because the inside here where the stem is a little bit on the green side, and there's some green in here. And I'm going to bring a little bit more out here, pop some green down in here. And this looks very different now from how it looked earlier. I'm going to bring out a little bit of red, just like a cadmium red. I don't need very much. Red's a pretty powerful color and it can tend to go opaque, so I don't want to use very much. But since the shape is wet, I can introduce this red and just let it kind of flow in here in whatever way it wants to. So I'm beginning to get a nice contoured shape, and I think a little ultramarine blue with the rose, notice I'm mixing in the palette there, will help me get a bit of a shadow over here. My light is coming from the back. So we're going to make a shadow. We're going to get a little more blue. There's also a shadow in the throat here of the apple. So I'm using a fairly small brush to kind of keep that area in the back there. And that's all I'm going to do on the second glaze. And I can glaze it many, many, many more times. The fourth skill we're going to learn is dry brush. And I'm using 140-pound rough paper for that because it's a toothier paper. And what we're going to do is drag a drier brush on dry paper and get a textural effect. So I'm going to ask you to choose your brush carefully here and practice before you paint on your piece. I usually use a round brush, but you see what you come up with on the style and size brush that you need to achieve the look you want. Dry brush is usually for things like feathers and hair and barn texture, rust, and it's wonderful for getting the sparkles on a beach or on the sand. So you want to dilute your paint a little thicker for this. You want it a little bit more like cream. So that's pretty thick. Then what I'm going to do is take a paper towel and make sure there's no excess paint at the ferrule here. That's pretty important. And then you just want to drag the brush across the surface of the paper, and you can see how that would make such a great effect for water. The ocean, the light popping along the surface of water. So try those four. See if you can make sparkles. And next we're going to do the graduated wash. The fifth skill is called the graduated wash. You may find that you need to practice this skill a bit more. It's another wet on wet skill, meaning that you'll be painted with diluted paint on evenly wet paper. The paint will be a darker value and will become lighter as you work your way toward the bottom of the page. When you initially begin, the paint might be diluted to cream, then more diluted to milk, then the consistency of tea, and finally almost pure water. I usually select a nice fat round brush that will hold a lot of paint and water. I often use another brush to dilute the paint. And make sure you have plenty of paint mixed because you will certainly be using it all. So this is a good example of a graduated wash, and now I am going to paint one for you. I have already diluted my paint. I'm using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna so that I can create a nice cloudy sky. And first of all, we're going to wet the paper. You want to use the largest brush you can. A lot of times I will use a flat brush for this, but today I'm using this nice round brush that holds a good bit of water. I'm going to overlap, overlap, overlap. Then I'm going to refill the brush, tap to the lip of the bowl, and overlap, overlap, overlap. Fill the brush again, tap to the bowl, overlap, overlap, overlap. And I'm going to go all the way to the bottom, and then I'm going to tip the paper. This is very important because you're going to miss a few spots because of the tooth of the paper repelling the water. So you want to really make sure that you have a very even coverage here. So just tip it back and forth until you know that it's quite even. So it looks like I have a nice glistening, evenly glistening surface now, so I can get started. I'm going to load my brush from the tip to the ferrule with this nice, rich watercolor paint. I want to be sure it's thick enough. I'm going to add a little bit more blue because it feels a little bit too watery. And remember, we're putting watery paint on watery paper, so we really want it to be pretty thick paint. So here we go. And we're going to do an overlapping stroke, maybe one more, just slightly over here. Now we're going to get rid of a good bit of this paint, tap it to the towel. We're going to overlap and overlap, pulling this bead down. And now we're going to get rid of more paint and tap it to your paper towel. You don't want to get all the paint off, just some. And you want to keep bringing this down all the way. Then we're going to get rid of even more paint. And, you know, I think I'm painting with almost pure water at this point. So here we go. We've got a beautiful graduated wash. And I can tip the paper just enough to let the paint run. And that pigment is going to run down in a really beautiful way. I did miss a spot right there, but we're going to try really hard not to worry. We're going to pick up the thirsty drips with the thirsty brush. And sometimes I even like to tap my paper. And there we go. And there is a beautiful graduated wash. Now, when would I use something like this? It's a great way to create skies, stormy skies, the sea, the sand, or any landscape that you need depth in, and anywhere you might need a beautiful and lively passage. So let me review the 5 basic skills that we just went through. These are the foundation of your watercolor painting in the future. So let's begin. Remember, the first skill was wet on wet. Wet paper, wet diluted paint, and this is great for areas where you want soft edges and less control. Beautiful for skies. The next technique was wet on dry. We used dry paper and wet diluted paint. This gives you a little bit more control. The third skill was dry brush, where you scrape the brush along the tooth of the paper to get texture. Wonderful for fur, the sparkle on water, barnwood textures. The fourth skill is the glaze, which is a beautiful way to build contour, depth, dimension. And you take your subject, you wet it thoroughly, glistening, even, push the paint all around, and you do not have to use one color. You dry that thoroughly, that's the key. This is the second glaze where I wet the object, laid down more paint, maybe different colors, dried it thoroughly, and here is a pair that has had 4 glazes. Again, wet the area evenly so the top was glistening, and wherever the water is, the paint went, and then I dried it thoroughly. And the 5th skill is the graduated wash. This one takes a bit more planning. Have your paint dilute and ready to go. And of course, it's a wet on wet technique. You'll wet that area. You'll lay the paint down with the entire brush from the tip to the ferrule, and then overlap. Get rid of a little bit of paint, overlap, overlap, get rid of some more, and you'll be painting almost with clear water toward the end. The important thing about the graduated wash is, again, make sure you have that planning done first and then let that paint do what it wants to do.